This is a series of videos I would like to do to educate atheists as to the Bible, because I get a lot of atheists that claim they know about the Bible, but when they make arguments against me, it unravels. Their claim unravels. I see gaping holes in their understanding, even the most fundamental biblical historicity, biblical knowledge. I mean, just it's astounding at their lack of education, lack of knowledge in that area. So, and this is not done to be demeaning. Now, don't get me wrong. This is the Atheist Guide to the Bible, but it's done to bring you up to speed. And I want to correct some things that have been said by atheists and make sure you understand these things. And if I tell you to come back and watch this video, that's the reason is that you've exposed a major error and you clearly don't understand it. So I may cite this video or the whole series, or hopefully just one or two videos where I'm touching on the specific subject where you made a mistake. Because what we need to be patently clear about, this is the one time you're going to see me wave a leather-bound edition, is what we're talking about when we're talking about the Bible. I constantly get atheists that claim that this is, and I refer to it as an omnibus. This is not a book. Hello, this is not a book. This is an omnibus of books. There are 66 independent, individual books in this omnibus. They stretch over at least 3,000, if not 4,000 years in writing. And they talk about almost every aspect of life. So when you come in here and think that just by discrediting one book that you've accomplished something in this omnibus, you can't. If you want to refute this Bible, you have to prove that all 66 books are wrong. All 66 books must be proven wrong because they're all independent books. Now, the introduction is that, again, this is an omnibus. There are 66 books. There are 39 books in what we call the Old Testament, which is the Old Covenant. That was the covenant that God made with Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, when he brought Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, where he was living in the Fertile Crescent, in the wickedness that was developing in his day, and he was a righteous man that rejected that. Not a perfect man, not a holy man, and God called him out and made an agreement with him that if he would serve God and come out of that wickedness, that God would give him children as the stars in the sky, the origin of the Jewish nation. Now, that is under a covenant of law, and this is where a lot of atheists get mad about, I hate the God of the Old Testament, he's so mean. Well, no, the Old Testament covenant with Abraham was a covenant of law, that they would keep God's law, and they would go with the system of sacrifice as was with Melchizedek, the priest that offered sacrifice. And Melchizedek did predate Abraham. So you have 39 of these books that describe, the Pentateuch is the first 5 books, which describe the history of the Bible. You have Genesis, which is the early history of the entire universe, all the way into Jewish history. And the other books in there, in the Pentateuch, that are specific history to the Jewish nation, giving the laws of the Jewish nation, and how they were received, etc., etc. Then the rest of the books we have broken down into more history, poetry, and the prophets, major and minor. So you have prophecy in here that was already fulfilled. You have the prophecies of Daniel at the time to the Persian Empire and the Medo-Persian Empire, where he prophesied to Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar, and the prophecies came true. The prophecy of Daniel, where the angel went from battling the Prince of Persia to battle the Prince of Greece, which was the end and the fall of the Persian empires after the Medo-Persian Empire, and the arise of the Greek city-state and its Greek empire. You have the major minor prophets, some of whom have prophesied toward the future, but they prophesied hundreds, if not 1,000 or more years before the birth of Christ, as to the messianic prophecies. Now, the New Testament is 27 books of eyewitness accounts and letters and a book of prophecy in regard to the coming of Jesus. It picks up after the time of the Maccabees in Israel, where the Greek and then later the Roman Empire conquered Israel. Remember, 2 empires occurred after the Old Testament, so there's a lot of time in between. And then we have the New Testament, 27 books, which describe and tell us about the teachings of Christ and the exposition from the Old Testament, explaining the New Covenant. And the reason why it's called the New Testament, it was a new covenant. It was when God looks at the people and says, I'm going to pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. I'm going to live inside of you. And you will be the temples of God. No longer do you have a temple system and a system of laws. You're now the laws written on your heart, and you live it yourself, and you interact with God personally. So it's a new covenant, a new testament, and it came about through the coming of the Christ, Ho Christos, Jesus, the Christ, the anointed one of God, who was there to save Israel from their sins first, as prophesied in Zechariah and in Isaiah, that he would come and save their people from their sins, and the other prophets of the Old Testament, fulfilling their prophecies, and then dying on the cross in the four Gospels, and going to heaven, ascending to heaven publicly in front of hundreds of witnesses. So, in the New Testament, we have the differences in the Old Testament and New Testament is the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, a very powerful poetic language that was perfect for prophecy and symbolism. And I mean, just for those of you that don't know Hebrew, you should study something about Hebrew. It's a very incredible language with a numeric system attached to it and coding. And I'm not endorsing the Bible code. I'm just saying that there is a number associated with each Hebrew letter, and it is a very powerful, complex language. And the reason that it's so perfect for the Old Testament is in the beginning, Bereshit bara Elohim ha-shamayim ve'eretz. In the beginning, God, the one God, created the heavens and the earth. The beauty of the Hebrew language is that it allows for third person, first, second, third person as different verbs, even in the past tense. Now, for those who don't grasp that, you non-grammar students, in English is such a very vulgar, very common, very quick language that it doesn't have three different verb constructs in all the past tenses. So you can't reflect first person singular, second person singular, and third person singular in the past tense. However, Hebrew did and does. So in the Old Testament, we see the Trinity of God in the very first verse of the Bible, which indicates that there's more to God than one. It says they in the subject, and then the verb is the past tense for the singular. They, the one God, created the heavens and the earth. So we see a powerful language is able to incorporate that, as well as the symbolism of the prophecy of all the prophets, and to have multiple layers of understanding, because we see a lot of the New Testament in the Old Testament. So the New Testament is the four Gospels that tell us about the Christ, his coming, in his death, his teachings, and lay it out from the eyewitnesses that were there. And it's written in Greek. Why do we love the dead languages? We love the dead languages for you fops out there that annoy me by insulting God, saying, I didn't know we were going to debate dead languages. We are. Why did Hebrew go dead? Why did Greek go dead? Because their language went dead so the meanings wouldn't change. So that when we got the copies of the Hebrew and Greek texts, they still meant the same thing 2,000 years later as they meant when they were said in the day they were said. Koine Greek was a dead language, and it encapsulated the New Testament in a language that could not be changed and reinterpreted through the Middle Ages, through the monks and all that nonsense, and they were brought to us pristine to today, so that in 1611, the King of England could commission some of the greatest ancient linguistic scholars of the history of mankind to translate the Old Testament texts and the New Testament Greek text accurately as possible into the common language of the people, bringing about and helping bring about, with the Gutenberg Bible and the King James Bible, the complete end of the Dark Ages, the Renaissance, and a movement toward a general knowledge and a movement toward Reformation away from the Catholic system, and a remaining away from it to this day. So why Koine Greek? Because Koine Greek is perfect. It's a perfect constructed logical languages for the concrete logic of the New Testament. And people don't understand, we don't have a blind faith in Christian theism, and we don't have an illogical faith. The whole New Testament is constructed and presented as a logical dissertation on the existence of God, the authority of God, the right to teach of God, the teachings of God, why you should accept God, how you should live, and how the Old Testament explains the New Testament. All in a logical language. God comes at you from a logical position. I'm tired of these people saying that we're irrational and all this other lies and propaganda, because if we're irrational, why in the world did God sit there for 27 books in the New Testament and over come from a position of empiricism and logic? Jesus looked at his disciples and said, if you cannot believe me about earthly things, how can you believe me about heavenly things? He was saying, if you cannot believe my knowledge of the physical universe, how can you believe me on metaphysical things which you cannot see? He demanded that they understand empirically, and they listened to him, and everything was given in a form of, we have these witnesses. This was known. The faking of Jesus' death was known. The very fact that there is an excuse, an alternative theory that the disciples stole the body, is evidence that his body was gone. And it was a publicly known fact in 30 to 33 AD that 3 days, on the third day after Jesus was publicly executed, that his body disappeared. And nobody could find him. If the Jews had had the body, they would have dragged out the rotted corpse of Jesus and paraded him through the streets and said the disciples are liars. This is why the legend theory and the swoon theory, all this nonsense doesn't work, because at the very time that it happened, there were actual historical events. And God comes at you and says, well, when Thomas is sitting there going, this can't be you, Lord. You're dead. And he says, put your hand in my side. Put your fingers through the holes that the nails forged into my hands. Touch me, know that it is I. And Thomas falls on his feet, having stuck his hand into the open wound of the Messiah, and falls on his knees and says, my God and my Master. This is not a God who says, just have blind faith. Just take it on faith. This feel-good gay God of the just softies, he just loves everybody, and just take him at his word, and you just never see him. He's just a magical little pixie, just flits about doing magical things. No, this is a God who approaches you in a logical manner and offers you empirical proof. Put your hand in the nail scar. Feel the hole. Now do you believe me? So there's nothing irrational about that. That's how we practice science. I look at people, and my mentor looked at me and said, you're wrong. That species is not there. And I said, no, I've got the proof. And he said, you're wrong. I said, no, I've been occasionally wrong on identifying species in the past, but I know my species identification down pat now. You've known it for some years, and I'm here to tell you that species was in that bay. He said, no, it can't be. I said, fine, I'll get you the picture. And I brought him back a photograph. And the first thing out of his mouth was, you're right, Ken. That species was there. I see the background. I see the picture's not Photoshop. This was before Photoshop. I see it's real. You're right. Wow. I can't believe you. I couldn't believe that species could be there, but you're right. And I said, you doggone Skippy, I was right. I wouldn't lie to you and say something that's not there. But I did not tell him, oh, my friend, have blind faith in me. Just believe that I have seen the great genus species in this area that they're not supposed to be, over 2,000 miles from their breeding grounds. No, I said, here's the picture. And this is how God deals with us. He says, listen, you don't have to believe one guy. Hey, Peter denied me and ran. He was a coward. Nobody wanted to listen to him. That's fine. You don't listen to Peter, listen to Paul. He saw me on the road himself. I appeared to him. If you don't want to believe him, believe the other 3 accounts from people that were there. He brings in a tax collector and a physician into his inner circle, people who would be very critical of what was said, who are scientific. A tax collector notes everything at that time. If he was a righteous tax collector, he's noting everything to make sure that he's above board and that he records everything perfectly. This is the kind of evidence God gives you. So this is the Bible that you're dealing with, this omnibus book of 66 different books. Now, as far as where does it come from, if you're going to refer back and debate it, you have to be able to go back to the original words. So if you don't know, you can use an interlinear Greek and Hebrew translation. Now, you make sure, and this is where most atheists don't know much about Bibles. There are 2 sets, or actually 3 sets. You have Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus, which are rejected as far as copies of the Bible. and then we have the codices that were used for the Bible. We do not use the same texts that are modern Greek and Hebrew text, one collated by the son of a Nazi, which his name escapes me, that did a new compilation of the Old Testament texts of the Old Testament, and the Nestle Aland or Westcott and Hort, which were two, one of them at least was absolutely occultic, the other is questionably occultic, who created the New Testament text in the last 110 years. We do not accept those. The King James translation was from the earliest available text, which is the Erasmus Greek received text of the New Testament, which we have the John Ryland papyri, which verified their authenticity and their correctness with the original texts that are dated more than 1,000 years old. The Old Testament is not the new Stuttgartensia is one of the names of that new version. No, we use the Masoretic Hebrew Old Testament text, which was the Masoretes, because if they copied it with the same system that God told them to use in the Old Testament, that each line had to have the same exact number of characters, and if one character was wrong, you burn the entire manuscript and start it again, because not one letter, not one yod or dechat, for those of you who know Hebrew, not one yod, Y is the smallest vowel in the Hebrew language, and the dechat is the smallest little hash mark to tell you how to pronounce that vowel, could pass away from God's word until all was fulfilled. So the Old Testament had to be done that way. So we accept their text. And for those of you who don't know anything about this subject and think this is something new, we found wonderfully preserved copies in the Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah, proving that there was no Deutero-Isaiah. There weren't two Isaiahs. There was one big book of Isaiah, and the others from the Essenes preserved in the clay jars that verified that the Masoretic Hebrew text is a true ancient text, thousands of years old, with no changes over the thousands of years. You can't say that for a lot of other writings. So you want to get a Greek and Hebrew interlinear that establishes at the very front, this is how you would look it up. I should have marked this. But you want to look in the front of it to find out which versions of the Hebrew and Greek. You want the oldest one. You want the Greek received text, the Textus Receptus in Greek, and you want the Old Testament Masoretic or Benachim rabbinical text, not the new Stuttgartensia, and definitely not the Westcott and Hort or Nestle Aland text of the New Testament, which is it was rewritten. The funny thing is, though, for those of you that have looked at it, if you get the Zondervan copy of the Greek interlinear Bible, they use the false Nestle Aland text. And the funny thing is, even with the Nestle Aland text, the King James Authorized Translation of 1611 more accurately matches the direct interlinear, means line by line with a direct translation of each word. So it's not something you can read, but it's a literal translation. And that almost literal translation matches the King James Authorized Translation of 1611 more than the NIV or the New International Version. So if you want to debate me, I don't want to hear from any other translation. If you're going to quote the 66 books of the Bible, you quote in English, you quote the proper translation, which is the King James translation or the King James Bible or the Authorized Version, all the same thing. Now, you don't have to quote it from the 1611, because I know most of you, unlike me, were not trained to read 1611 English. Okay, for those of you who did not read Beowulf in the original tongue, sorry you didn't have a good English teacher in the 9th grade, but some of us did, and we learned to read archaic English as well as ancient English, and it's quite an interesting language, but forsooth it's rough. But give me the quote you want to make in the Authorized Translation, because that is the most accurate translation of the Old Testament books and the New Testament books. And again, there's no magic bullet. You can't refute the Bible by claiming there's an error in a single book. You have to shoot down every book, because in every book there's overlap. Okay, a quick little side now. The oldest book of the Bible is not Genesis. It's the book of Job, as he suffered. The book of Job also references the dinosaurs and other things. It is the most ancient of books, predating the Pentateuch that was ostensibly scribed by Moses. So we do not claim that God himself wrote the Bible directly with his hand. He did write his law. The Ten Commandments were written by hand on stones and given to Moses. So it's not the Mosaic law. The Mosaic law is not the Ten Commandments. The Mosaic law is the ceremonial law given to the Jews under theocracy. It does not apply to Gentiles or non-Jews, and it does not even apply to Jews who have no temple and are not living under God directly. Once they chose a king, they started migrating away from the ceremonial law and the theocratic system. So once that occurs, they can't go back and say, we're gonna stone people. That's why Jesus was, when they brought the woman that was caught in adultery, magically the guy disappeared. He didn't get himself caught, but the poor woman that was caught in adultery, she was brought to Jesus to be summarily executed, and Jesus looked at them and said, well, that's fine. If she's guilty, that's fine. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. Because he was pointing out to the Jews in that day that they were no longer keeping his law, but they were superimposing their own, and that he was there to fulfill that law and to die for their sins, that the death penalty would not be there, and that they should not be running around using the death penalty all the time and not judging everyone, that they were just judging the people they wanted to die and that they wanted to make trouble for, and that they were still forcing it even though they were no longer a sovereign nation with their own God as king or an actual earthly king. Because remember, God did not want Israel to have kings. He said, I'll be your king and you can have total freedom. Israel, under theocracy, had the greatest libertarian society in the history of mankind since the formation of organized nations. And they threw it all away and demanded a king. And God said, fine, kings will tax you and kings will take your sons to war. But if you want a king and you don't want to have your own freedom and you don't want to tribally get together as a militia and defend yourselves if another country attacks you, fine, I'll give you a king, but you'll understand what slavery is in a big way now. So he did that. And they learned the hard way. So when we're talking about New Testament Jews, we're not talking about a theocratic nation. We're talking about a Roman-occupied province of Judea. It's no longer an Israeli nation state. It's a province of Rome. So Jesus answers that it's time to give up the old punishment where there was not a court system. Now you have a system of courts and judges, and you have to go before a Roman pontiff in a lot of cases to get your issue handled before the proper magistrate, because you can't even have all your own magistrates anymore. You're occupied by Rome. So that's enough on that subject. The basics is, if you want to debate the Bible and quote the Bible, you should quote it from the proper English translation that came from the oldest texts. I don't have to answer a text that didn't exist until the late 1800s, or a text that just popped up in the early 1900s in Stuttgartensia from, like I said, the son of a Nazi. I have to answer from the oldest Hebrew and the oldest Greek text, which are the Masoretic text, or the rabbinical text, and the Textus Receptus as collated by Erasmus. And again, proven by the Dead Sea Scrolls for the Old Testament and the John Ryland Papyri for the New Testament. And if the John Ryland Papyri wasn't good enough, we have the bulk of the New Testament was quoted over and over by the early church writers for the first century and a half, almost 2 centuries afterwards. They quoted, if we'd lost the entire New Testament, we could have simply taken the writings of Clement of Rome and all the other writings of Polycarp, etc., and pulled down those letters and the early letters or epistles, and we'd have that. And that's the other thing. Remember, the New Testament, the bulk of the New Testament is not the Gospels. The over half of the New Testament is the letters of Paul, John, and a couple of other disciples that wrote letters to the new church, discussing matters of theology and Bible exposition. So this is the first. We'll stop here. This is the first section of the Bible for Atheists, and you should watch these videos and get the information from a teacher of the Bible, from a scholar of the Bible for decades, who has studied these matters and who understands a bit of Greek and a bit of Hebrew. And for those of you that don't know, Hebrew is now a living language, though the meanings are not supposed to change, and it is spoken by Israelis and Jews all over the world now. They even have a new committee in Israel that creates words for new stuff. If the language doesn't develop a new word for television or radio, they assign it a word in Hebrew so that they know what the word will be. And it's been an interesting thing. And the beauty of it is that in understanding it, they went back to the Old Testament to understand it, to make sure that their meanings are correct. So until the next section of this video, digest this. If you need to watch it again. This is just a very basic, very primer thing, but to cover the material in a quick way, so you understand what's behind the Bible, because we don't believe in blind faith. We don't endorse blind faith, and you shouldn't accept blind faith from anybody. And if God talks to you and tries to appeal to you through rational, logical thought and arguments and empiricism, then that is the exact opposite of what you're being told by these useful idiots of what Christian theism is, because that's totally a straw man argument, because the God of the universe came to you in the flesh, then left you writings and appealed to you with eyewitness reports through logic, history, philosophy, theology, and empirical evidence. So until the next section, have a good day.